So let's watch the video. So as you see here, if the Earth was stationary and the stars were stationary above it, the star would just come straight down into the telescope. Now, if the telescope was actually moving underneath the stars, you would have to tilt the telescope, as you see here, because the star is going to come in at an angle, just like the rain. And this is the belief that the Earth is moving, the telescope's on the Earth, therefore the telescope is moving and it has to be tilted so that you can keep the starlight in the center. Now, this alternative idea proposed in this video is that there's ether movement carrying the stars, but we know the stars are moving over top of a stationary Earth in the other position. So as the stars move, it's carried as it's moving. You can think of a giant vortex or whirlpool, basically, that's swirling around. As it makes its way down to the telescope, it also will come in at an angle, right? So Airy come up with a genius way on how to figure this out. And so what he did was say, okay, again, if you see here that you can have the Earth moving with a telescope. Now, he decided to put water in the telescope because that's going to slow down the starlight. It's going to take longer for it to get there. So if the Earth is moving and the telescope's moving, as you see here, the starlight will enter and then it will deflect more and it will hit the side of the telescope. This is because light goes through the water or appears to travel through the water roughly 1/4 slower, 25 to 33%. So then if you were to tilt it at 10 degrees to compensate for it, and these are just numbers used to explain the idea, then it would remain in the center of the telescope. You would actually have to tilt the telescope more to keep the starlight in the center. Okay, so hopefully this visualization actually really makes it make sense for you. But again, if you were to tilt it and put water in it, but the Earth wasn't moving, it would barely shift because it was still coming at an angle because it's coming from a moving sky, but there's no significant change. You've just added a different medium, you slowed it down a little bit, but the cause of the angle itself hasn't changed at all because it's that the sky itself is moving. That hasn't changed. It's still moving at the same rate. And so it's just coming to us from the sky, so it's barely going to change when you add water. These are two very distinctly different predictions that would happen. Okay, so hopefully this visualization really helps you out. I think that's what people need to do is see it. Okay, so that is the idea of the test. It was quite brilliant, right? Now, what did he actually observe? The amount the star must displace according to the heliocentric model was not observed. This actually falsifies the assumed equivalence in favor of the geocentric model. This will be covered more extensively in a future episode. I actually kept the duplicate on accident, so that's the old description, but it doesn't matter. You look at the chart here, you'll see that there was only 0.8 arc seconds observed. But based on the actual orbital velocity, if we look at the amount of stellar aberration throughout the year, and we take that to be the orbital velocity, we know the relationship between the deflection and the orbital velocity. If you were to account for the light slowing down in the water, then you were supposed to get 30 seconds, 30 arc seconds. But only 0.8 arc seconds was observed. It's a major problem. This is why it's called Airy's failure, because it didn't match the prediction. Now they try to spin it that it was just a debunk of the ether. We will cover how that makes no sense though. So here's an actual screenshot from the paper itself, from Airy, directly under the charts. And if you go to docs.witsit.tv, I'll shortly have all of it uploaded, including the PDFs. So here we see, says, I think myself justified in concluding that the hypothesis of the professor is untenable. Had it been retained, the aberrations to be employed in the corrections would have been increased by plus 15 and minus 15 seconds, respectively, and the two mean results would have disagreed by 30 seconds. Okay, so that's the specific prediction that has to happen. Again, if we go back over here and we look at the video, we'll see, right? Oh, it's not going to let me move it over. We'll see that when we add water, it deflects into, see if I can change it here. No, I can't. Anyway, you saw the visualization as the light comes into the water-filled telescope, it deflects off and it hits the side. This was the prediction. Now here is Michelson addressing it in the Michelson-Morley paper, which, by the way, is called On the Relative Motion of the Earth and Luminiferous Ether. It says, but it failed to account for the fact proved by experiment that the aberration was unchanged when observations were made with a telescope filled with water. That's, of course, Airy's failure. For if the tangent of the angle of aberration is the ratio of the velocity of the Earth to the velocity of light, then since the latter velocity in water is 3/4 its velocity in a vacuum, the aberration observed with the water telescope should be 4/3 its true value. And it's pretty much the same in air, right? The quote-unquote speed of light. Again, semantics. If you want to point out, I don't actually believe it travels. It doesn't matter. For intents and purposes, it's the same thing. The rate at which it is perceived to travel. Specifically, illuminate. Now, make sure everyone understands that. Water is 3/4 its velocity in a vacuum. The aberration observed with the water telescope should be 4/3 of its true value. But since the displacement is proportional to the square of the velocity, the relative velocity of the Earth and the ether is probably less than 1/6 the Earth's orbital velocity and certainly less than 1/4. In what precedes, only the orbital motion of Earth is considered. If this is combined with the motion of the solar system, concerning which but little is known with certainty, which they make a specific claim is going about 500,000 miles per hour now, then the result would have to be modified. So actually, the current prediction would be slightly different based on the predictions of the additional vectors that are in the model now. It is just possible that the resultant velocity at the time of the observations was small, though the chances are much against it. The experiment must therefore be repeated at intervals of 3 months, and thus all uncertainty will be avoided. Okay. We don't even need to read much more there. Okay. Like I said, I'm going to keep this. This is going to be very simple, and actually, we'll just explain it with this here. Okay. Now, when I was on Timcast, what he said was that the cause of stellar aberration is that the Earth is orbiting, moving under the starlight, similar to you running under rain, so it causes a certain deflection. And then later, he said that when the water was filled with telescope, that the orbital motion wouldn't cause a deflection to the light. And he went as far as to say that the light comes in at the telescope already at an angle. Okay. If the Earth is moving underneath the starlight, causing the deflection, then that has to remain the claimed cause at all times. If the starlight is slowed down to 3/4 the speed by adding water, but the Earth kept moving at the same speed, it would increase the deflection. It would physically have to. This is a physical requirement. It's a velocity component. It isn't negotiable. It's just a physical fact that if it was physically moving underneath the starlight, then it would deflect based on that orbital motion, right? And he went as far as to say that only the ether theory would predict that it would change, because there's no way for the water to know which way to slow down the light, and the lateral deflection would be slowed down the same as the vertical deflection. Therefore, there would be no additional deflection unless there was an ether, whereas the water would know which way to slow down the light. Makes no sense. Literally no sense. Now, it has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with proving the ether. That isn't what the test was about at all. Okay, it was trying to understand the nature of light. You have what's called the undulatory theory, which is wave properties, and then you have like this photonic idea, right? Now, I think that this has been very simple, right? And I want to keep it pretty short and very simple. If you see here that if the Earth is actually moving and the light comes in the telescope, it's going to keep moving, and so what happens is it actually starts to deflect and then hit the side. But if the telescope itself isn't moving underneath the starlight and you add water, it's going to slow down the starlight, but the deflection, or the motion that's causing deflection, doesn't have any additional effect. It's already moved. As it's moving from the source, it's going to only slightly vary because you slowed it down. But if it's actually the Earth moving underneath it, it's going to change based specifically on the orbital velocity proportional to that velocity. Okay, so I know that was very repetitive, but when they say it has a profound effect on the undulatory, he said that in that, and I'll cover it more specifically later, what he said, maybe even the whole stream, quote unquote debate, just a discussion, but he said that it had a profound impact on the undulatory nature of light. Well, specifically what is discussed in the papers is that if you were to have the ether carrying the light, then there would be a specific amount required, right? And, okay, sorry. So if it were basically waving, then you would have, it would require it basically move in the opposite direction. If you had like an ether and an undulatory nature of light, which just means wave. Okay. Now, what the guy said and what the popular belief would be is that light is photons, and that's what he said. The photon enters the telescope. So I want to explain why this wouldn't work, because again, he was just saying that it wouldn't change. But if you're claiming that, I'm just very repetitive. If you're claiming that the actual deflection of the starlight is because the Earth is orbiting, meaning the cause of aberration, the reason it changes throughout the year, it goes one way 6 months and changes over 6 months, which is what you would expect with a rotating cosmos. That's what they're claiming is happening with the orbiting Earth. Okay. If the cause of the deflection of the light in the telescope is the fact that it comes in at an angle because it's being deflected, right? If it's actually the Earth moving, that means the Earth's moving under the light that's coming straight down to you, right? Because in the heliocentric model, the stars appear to move, but they're not actually moving. We're spinning and orbiting, making the stars look like they move. So if the star's coming straight down to us, but we're moving underneath it, then it's going to cause it to come in like the tilted rain at an angle. If you were to slow down the light, the Earth would keep moving at the same speed. Therefore, it would deflect that much more. So actually, if you kept it tilted at the original angle, it would like hit the side of the telescope. It shouldn't even make it to you. Okay. Now, this is where they had a serious problem, and they're discussing the nature of light. The reason they're doing that is because they assume the orbital motion at the onset, just like that meme said. That's correct. They assumed it, and now nothing makes sense. When you assume it, nothing makes sense, and they can't get it to work. Okay. So it being called Airy's failure would only make sense with a proper recollection of, it failed to have a viable explanation with the assumption that the Earth's orbital velocity or motion is what caused the actual deflection. Okay. Now, think about this. If you have the light coming in and you were to claim that it is because like a photon of light is coming in, going down to the bottom of the telescope, that's how you interpret it. In order for the photon explanation, you have to say, if this interpretation is invoked, that a photon of light enters the telescope from the star, it requires the claim that the photon sped up upon entering the water. Obviously, right? Because for the amount of deflection to not change when the water was introduced, you would actually have to claim that the photon itself sped up. Now, he goes on to explain that they actually verified for sure that the light in the telescope itself was in fact slowing down. Right. So if you think that there's like a photon of light coming in there, then you're going to have to say that it sped up once it entered the water, and that's why the deflection didn't really change. The problem with that is it would violate the laws of conservation of energy and momentum. Now, let's explain this. thus is not viable. So another example of why this would be the case is if you were to take a piece of glass and you shoot a laser through it, it looks like the laser slows down by roughly 30%. So if it actually slowed down, what happens when the laser makes it on the other side of the glass and then all of a sudden it is going the same quote unquote speed, right? Well, if it slowed down but then sped back up, it would have to have some new energy introduced to it so that it could speed back up. It couldn't just magically speed back up without any additional energy involved, because that would violate the law of conservation of energy and momentum. It can only conserve the momentum it has. Once it slows down, it can't just speed back up. So what the mainstream explanation for this is that it appears to slow down because it's increasing its path distance, but actually it's going the same speed, just the distance increase. The speed equals distance over time. So if you increase the distance, and you can try to say that it appears to slow down, but it's actually not slowing down, right? Now, that actual explanation, if you were to say that it just went into the glass, slowed down, and then left the glass and sped up, would violate the law of conservation of energy and momentum. This is the case for if the photon entered the telescope and then sped up, because what energy was introduced to the photon magically right at the moment that it was introduced to the water? Nothing. So it would violate the law of conservation of energy and momentum, those laws. So that isn't viable, isn't an explanation, which is what he was claiming. He was claiming that the photon enters whatever. So I think I've explained it many times, and I want to keep this very short, right? But just to recap it, right? Stellar aberration is similar to rain falling. Okay, so if the rain's falling straight down and you run underneath it, it'll look like it's coming in at an angle. If you were to speed up, it'll come in at more of an angle. If you were to keep running the same speed but let this actually slow the rain down, or the rain started falling slower, then it would also increase the angle, right? Because the amount of distance that you've covered underneath the rain before it could make it to you has increased. That means that the perceived angle, the apparent deflection or angle, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The greater the distance you cover underneath it, the greater the deflection or the angle. Hopefully you can visualize this because it's quite simple, right? It looks like it's coming in straight. You start running underneath it, it's going to look like it's coming in towards you. If you can cover more distance before it gets its way all the way down, it's going to get more and more and more of an angle, right? In theory, you could run so fast that it would almost be parallel to the ground because you're covering so much distance before it can actually get to you that it's deflecting more and more. So this is the claim for why there is stellar aberration. The mainstream model claims stellar aberration is caused by the orbit of the Earth. In fact, we just saw that there will be mainstream claims that claims it was the first definitive proof of heliocentrism and the orbital motion. The guy on Timcast specifically said that that's how it works, that the fact the Earth is orbiting causes stellar aberration. And of course, they say this because it also changes throughout the year. It goes 6 months one way, 6 months the other way. So they say, oh, because the Earth's going around the sun. So the claim on the table for heliocentrism is that the actual motion of Earth itself through space causes stellar aberration, just the apparent deflection of the starlight, as the stars appear to move daily with the sidereal rotation and annually with the precession. As it moves annually and appears to, really they're not. The stars are staying still the whole time. We're just spinning ourselves, and it looks like the Earth, looks like the sky spinning. It's just an illusion, and that we're orbiting. And so the aberration is just an illusion, an apparent deflection caused by the fact that we are moving. Okay, so that's the official claim, is that stellar aberration is caused by orbital motion, which means the idea is the Earth is moving underneath the starlight as it comes down to you. So if you look at it in a telescope, you have to tilt it at an angle, because just like we saw in the visualization, and I'll show it again because I think it's very good. You look right here, as this telescope starts moving, which is akin to the Earth moving, because the telescope would also be moving, it's on the Earth. As you see here, that once the telescope starts moving, even though the starlight's coming straight down to you, as the telescope moves, it looks like it's coming at an angle. This visualization should really make it click with you what aberration is claimed to be in the heliocentric model, just like running under the rain. Okay, so he added water to the telescope. Again, I know this is very redundant. If you're able to grasp it fast, I get it. So the water slows the light down significantly, about 30% or 1/4, right? So if it slows it down by about 1/4 the speed, now you've increased the distance. In fact, the total value that you're going to get should actually be a fourth greater, like 4/3 the value that you had before that. So that means that if you were to just keep it at the same tilt, but the Earth kept moving the same speed, as the light comes in, normally it would be right in the middle of your telescope and get to you. But since it hits the water and slows down, but the telescope keeps moving as it's trying to make its way straight down to you, then it's going to deflect more and even hit the side of the telescope. It barely moved at all. It was supposed to move 30 total arc seconds when you take into account the mean, so 15 arc seconds to another 15 arc seconds taken throughout the year, and it only moved 0.8. So there should have been 30 arc seconds observed according to the heliocentric model. There was only 0.8 arc seconds observed. Okay, so definitively, there is no actual explanation for that, because either the Earth's orbit is causing a deflection, a physical separation between you and the starlight, or it isn't. If it is, it would also be doing that when it's in water, and since the light slows down, it would just increase that amount. If you claim that a photon's coming in there, you have to claim the photon entered the water and then sped up the perfect amount, but not quite perfect, to make it look like it was actually the Earth being stationary, right? And that the aberration was canceled out. Okay, so in very simple terms, it's this simple. Either the Earth is orbiting, moving underneath the starlight, causing the light to deflect, or it is not, period. Now, I will say, there are many other details that we could have got into. We could have got all through the papers and really discussed the undulatory nature of light, the implications within, the different theories proposed about how that could work, or what we would maybe call now the photonic idea of light, how that would work, all different implications, all different theories people proposed. But I'm just telling you that this is a definitive physical proof that the Earth is not moving. And you have to do mental gymnastics to claim otherwise. To claim that the water somehow knows how to slow it down with the preferred direction if there was an ether doesn't make any sense. Water isn't sentient. Well, it kind of has memory, seemingly, but you can't pick and choose. Either it is or it isn't. If it is, then it will always be doing that. Very simple. Either you're running under the rain or you're not. Either the rain is in a cloud, coming from a cloud, and the cloud's moving, or the cloud's sitting still, the rain's falling down, and you're running underneath the rain from the cloud, making it look like the cloud was moving, causing it to come in at an angle. Okay? When we slowed down the rain, or specifically the starlight, showed that the Earth was not moving. This is a definitive empirical falsification of the belief that the Earth is orbiting around the sun. Unless you want to change the claimed cause of stellar aberration. Of course, the heliocentric model cannot do that, because if the heliocentric model was true, it was actually orbiting around the sun, that would have to be the cause of stellar aberration. Therefore, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. The heliocentric model has no way out. The claim that the Earth is moving through space has no way out of this test. A water in a telescope definitively refutes it. That's why you'll never be taught this test in university. That's why there's no mainstream academic rebuttal to it, because no one can come up with anything. You have to come up with ideas such as, oh, there is an ether and there is a wave theory and it's moving at the opposite direction, just the amount to almost compensate for it, but not completely. Or there's a photon that comes into the telescope and speeds up, violating the law of conservation of energy and momentum to create the illusion that it perfectly compensates. And by the way, relativity basically makes a similar claim when it comes to Michelson-Morley, that the actual apparatus contracted and time slowed down, the distance contracted just the right amount to make it look like the Earth was stationary. Just trust me, bro. When it comes to this one, they can't even make up some insane unfalsifiable claim such as that. The actual claim of the light slowing down, or a photon entering and slowing down, would violate the law of conservation of energy and momentum on its face. It isn't true. You also can see that the starlight actually does in fact slow down. We know that light, you can actually, for example, if water's moving, you can take the velocity of the water and add it to the light to know exactly how fast that the light's going to go. So we know that there's a direct relationship between the velocity of the medium and the light, and we know there's a direct relationship between the medium itself and how fast the light can go through it. Again, disclaimer, I'm using all these terms for intents and purposes because that's the way that people understand it. That's the way it appears to operate. I think light's a bit more complex and nuanced than actually physically traveling from point to point. I think that it is already there. It just illuminates at a certain rate, but that is not consequential to this point. So I want to keep it very simple and just keep repeating it as many different ways as I can think of to explain it. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. There is no actual explanation to this. So just really think about this. Make sure you wrap your mind around it and just understand that there's a reason this has been omitted and lied to you about, right? And I invite any sufficient explanation, but simply saying that the light slows down the same in all directions doesn't make any sense. That doesn't matter at all. The light's supposedly coming straight down, the Earth's moving underneath it, making it look like it's coming at an angle. That keeps happening the entire way from the star to the ground, to the bottom of the telescope. The entire way, it appears to come at an angle based on how fast the Earth's moving underneath it. If you slow the starlight down, now you're going to get more of a deflection. It's going to actually come out of the telescope unless you tilt it at a better angle based on the water. That isn't what happens. If you actually tilt it, accounting for the assumption the Earth is moving 66,600 miles per hour, you won't even get the star in the first place. Right? You won't even actually be able to observe the star. Okay. There you go. That is middle ground. Episode 5, Airy's failure or success. The answer is that it was absolutely a success because it was a brilliant idea of how to actually test it. He proposed an idea that he thought would be definitive to show one way or the other. It absolutely did show one way or the other. It just wasn't what anyone was expecting or what they would want. So it was a very successful test. It was a very brilliant yet simple test, and it is one of the most concise, specific refutations of the heliocentric model. It isn't complex. People typically dismiss it because they say it can't be that simple. It can't be as simple as just a water-filled telescope, right? This idea that you can understand with an analogy of rain, no way this can debunk hundreds of years of science. You mean mainstream consensus philosophically biased pseudoscience? Absolutely it can. You can debunk the heliocentric model with something as simple as water and a telescope. You can do the observation yourself. You can make it precisely yourself. You can test all the times that it's ever been done. The actual result isn't disputable. That's why it's just this is omitted and slid under the rug because there is no actual explanation for it. Light doesn't magically conspire with water because it wants to make everyone think heliocentrism isn't true and then just somehow defies physics so that it looks like the Earth is stationary. This is the exact prediction of a stationary Earth. If you actually have the sky moving around the Earth and it's within a medium and it's coming down to that stationary Earth, as it comes down, since it's moving, you can imagine a whirlpool, right? It's going to slightly be drugged and have an angle that it comes in. That is what's expected with a stationary Earth. And so if you added water, it would be expected to barely change. But if you actually have a moving Earth, that's totally different. It's expected to move directly proportional to the velocity of the orbit or the Earth because it's still moving underneath the starlight actively as it enters the telescope. If you slow it down by 30% or 25%, you're going to actually increase the deflection proportionate to that 25% decrease in speed. So hopefully, I know that was a bit more like succinctly put there, but hopefully you guys follow it. I'm going to keep this one very short.